This is a web design course for absolute beginners. We have had 2 classes prior to this time. For this class, we are going to look at CSS, cascading style sheet. Most of your work actually as a web designer is just going to be extensive use of CSS to manipulate DOM elements or HTML elements. So understanding understanding CSS is very, very, very important. In fact, you can get your HTML game to like 50%, or even 30% or 40%. Just know like maybe 30 or 40% of the tags that you need to know. Every other thing is going to be CSS. At the end of this course, obviously, at the end of this particular class, we are going to have a project that we're going to work on, and that's going to be our portfolio. We're going to be working on our personal portfolio at the end of this class, so stay tuned and let's fire away. Let's have an overview of CSS. What exactly is CSS? It means cascading style sheet. We're going to break that down in a bit, but for now, let's look at the overview of CSS. First, CSS is composed of styles, right? Remember, the full meaning of CSS is cascading style sheet, and it is the language, right, that is used to beautify HTML. It's used to add color. It's used to add, basically design HTML, give HTML some form of beautification. Since we already know that HTML is just strictly structure, right, of the website. So CSS is composed of styles, right? Now, these styles are represented in a very unique way, not too unique, not too different from what you learned in HTML, where you had HTML could be defined by attributes, and those attributes had values, right? So CSS is quite similar. CSS is composed of styles, that those styles have a property and they have a value, right? And then you also have that CSS those styles, right, can be grouped into what we call rules. Okay, now these rules are strictly for the sole purpose of what? Manipulating HTML elements, right? So basically, you see how everything in CSS boils down to what? Manipulating HTML elements. It's composed of styles that have properties and values, and then these styles can be grouped into rules that eventually what? Manipulate what? HTML elements. So that is a top-down overview of what CSS is. And truth be told, if you know how each of these concepts plays a big role, then in CSS, then you'll be able to just master CSS. Now, let's look at cascading. We're going to try to break down the names as the cascading style sheet, right? So cascading, as per the Merriam-Webster dictionary, we have that it is something that is arranged or occurring in a series or in a succession of stages, so that each stage derives from or acts upon the product of the preceding. Now, this is a very big grammar, like there's too much English here. I'm even having a headache. So all you need to know from this is that cascading just simply refers to what? Something that is arranged, something that is arranged or something that occurs in a series or a succession of stages. That's all. So it can be arranged horizontally, as you have like what you have down here, item 1, item 2, item 3, or you could have something that is arranged vertically. But the idea is that one comes after another, one comes after another, right? So CSS is arranged with the way CSS is structured. This is the core structure basically of CSS. So if you understand this, then when we start talking about things like specificity, and how rules are being overridden and everything, that would begin to make sense. Let's move on a bit and then see what else we can find out about CSS. Now, remember in our previous overview of CSS, we said CSS is composed of what? Styles. And we said styles have what? Property and value. And then we said CSS can be grouped into rules, right? And then these rules, is basically for the sole purpose of manipulating HTML elements, right? So stick with me. I'm going to run through this slide, and then, at the end, we'll do a project to try out most of these things. So now, let's see what that style looks like, right, in code actually. So styles just refer to a property value pair that controls the display of HTML elements. It's very basic. This is what the anatomy of a CSS style looks like, right? You can also, some documents or some references will call it style declaration. So this is a style declaration, right? So a style declaration looks like this. It has a property separated by, the property and values are separated by what? A colon. Very, very important. Without that colon, there is nothing differentiating the property from the value. So the property first, then you have a colon, and then you have the value. And then you have a delimiter or a semicolon in this case, right? So that's just the basic anatomy of a style. This, like I said, this would make sense as we go along. Now let's look at what a style example is like, right? So say we have a HTML code, right? A piece of HTML code like this, hello world, right? Paragraph tag. This is, and then the preview is what you're seeing here. This is what, the preview is what will be rendered on your browser. Now, let's see how we can adjust the CSS styles or the CSS properties and corresponding values to alter what that text will look like, right? So if we're going to say we use the color property and then set the value to blue, that text is going to turn blue, right? That paragraph tag is going to turn blue. If we're to change the font size to 72 pixels, now pixels is one of the units, right, that we use in CSS. There are a couple of other units. There are relative units, there are absolute units, but we'll talk about that in another in our next class. But I just want us to focus on the basics, understanding what exactly we are looking at, right? So let's look at that again. We have color as a property. Now in CSS, or basically generally in programming, we don't use the British English. We actually use US. That's why color is being spelled as COLOR instead of COLOUR, right? So if you're British or have any affiliations with such, you just have to adjust. That's the life we live in right now. But yeah, so color refers to text color in CSS, right? So you don't say text color in CSS, you just say color. Now we are setting the color to what? Blue, and then we can see that show up. Next thing is we are now attacking the font size. Notice that there is no space between font and size. What you're having is a hyphen, right? If you find yourself writing a property with space, then you're wrong. You're doing something wrong, right? Properties, if properties involve more than one word, they are usually joined together with a hyphen, right? So we set the font size to 72 pixels, and we can see that the hello world text increased a bit, right? Then text decoration, we set the text decoration to strike through. Like if you want to add a strike through to that text, what the property, the CSS property that we're going to focus on, or we're going to use to be able to modify that particular attributes of the element is text decoration. Then we can bolden the text, right, by using font weight and specifying it to bold. There are other values, right, but we just want to bolden for now. And then we can set the background color of that particular text to yellow. So notice also background color uses hyphen instead of space. So ensure that you don't find yourself writing background space color, right? It's always a hyphen between them. Now, so that's the style example. Let's look at what rules are. Rules are just simply, collections of styles, basically. But then they are a single rule, right, is a collection of a property and value pair, which is a style, right? That's it's essentially what it does is it references a specific HTML element or a group of HTML elements, right, using what we call a selector. So if you look at the anatomy of a CSS rule declaration, you notice that we have a selector. The only difference between the rule declaration and the style declaration is you can see that the style declaration is embedded inside the rule declaration, enclosed by curly braces, and then you have a selector, which means the selector is what you use to target a particular HTML element you want to modify, right? and then you now specify the styles, or the styles that you want to apply to that particular HTML element, right? Like I said, as we move along, this would make more sense. Now, let's see how we can bring CSS into HTML, right? Because CSS, like we've always been saying from the start of the class, that CSS is our way of styling HTML. It's our way of adding beauty to HTML. So we've just been talking about CSS in isolation. We are going to be looking at how CSS, right? We can, bring CSS into HTML to be able to style these HTML elements that we're talking about, right? So before I continue with this, I know this class might be a little fast. We have just 40 minutes for this class, and we're already 14 minutes roughly in. If you have any questions whatsoever that we can take right now in the class, just type them in the chats. I'm going to read it out and then respond to the question as we go. Most of our engagements after this class is going to be on the EduStart platform. So yeah, that is that, right? So now let's look at what it would take to bring CSS into HTML, right? First thing, or the first way we can bring CSS into HTML is through a method we call inline CSS. This is simply directly writing your styles, right? This is simply directly writing your styles. Remember the concept, because when I use those concepts, I would need you to, try to reflect on, what a style is or what a rule is. Now, I'm talking about style, and when I talk about style, I'm talking about a property value pair. Property, colon, value, semicolon. That is a style. When I'm talking about a rule, I'm talking about selector, curly braces, property, colon, value, semicolon, right? So we can see that here. When I talk about style, this is what I'm talking about. Property, value. When I talk about a rule, right? When I talk about a CSS rule, I'm talking about selector, curly braces with styles inside. So that's like the easiest way to get that. So now for inline CSS, for the inline, as in adding CSS inline, this simply means directly, writing your CSS, code, right? Or your CSS style declarations inside the elements, right? The open tag of the element itself. And the only way we can do that is using the style attributes, right? So anytime you use the style attributes to add CSS to a particular element, that method is called inline CSS, right? So we can see what it looks like here. We already know what the anatomy of the element looks like. So all we just added there was what? Style attributes, and the value of the style attributes is now the CSS styles you want to add to that element. I hope that makes sense. Second way we can add CSS to HTML is through a method we call internal CSS, right? Now, this just simply means using a style element to add, right? This style element can be written anywhere in your CSS, in your HTML document, right? You could write this style element in your head, in the body, anywhere in your listen, so long, obviously, as is within the HTML parent HTML element. We'll see what that looks like. However, there are best practices to including internal CSS, and mostly it's always found in the head elements, right? So that is what we are going to be doing. Now, internal CSS, like I said, refers to writing CSS rules. Remember that now, this time I'm not talking about styles now, right? Because now we are writing it outside the element. So we need a way to select the element before we apply the styles. When we're talking about inline CSS, we're already writing the styles directly on the element. So we don't need a selector. That's why we're not using rules, we're using styles. Now we are taking our CSS, or our style declarations outside of the HTML elements. That's why we need a selector, so that we can specify which of the elements we want these styles to be added to, right? So internal CSS involves writing writing CSS rules, right, as content of the style elements. So okay, okay. Just to confirm, is everyone hearing me? I have someone complaining that he can't hear me. Okay, so okay, I think it's just a technical flaw from his end. Okay, so yeah, I would continue now. Okay. Okay, if you cannot hear me, just a little tip. If you cannot hear me, ensure that you've already clicked join with audio, whether it's computer audio or phone audio, but ensure you've clicked join with audio so you'll be able to hear me, right? So let's go on so we can have some time to look up our project, right? So just a quick recap. Inline CSS, few things to note. Simple. Inline CSS, you are directly writing your styles, right, on the HTML elements using the style attributes. That's all. Style attributes is what you need to add styles to the HTML elements if you're doing it the inline way. If you're using internal CSS, what you're doing is you're using the style element. So notice that you're seeing this open style tag and the close style tag, and then the content of that style element is now your CSS rules. Now, this time you're not just writing styles because you need to specify which elements that you're trying to style. So you need a selector, and then you need your curly braces to enclose your rules, right? So that is what we have for internal CSS. Now, the final way, and most times the most recommended way for adding CSS. Remember, we're still on how to add CSS to HTML, how to bring CSS into HTML. The final way that we're looking at is writing your CSS rules as a separate content of a separate file, right? So you just create a new file, right? And then dump all your CSS rules there. Note CSS rules, not just styles. Okay, so you're talking about selectors, and then the curly braces with the property and value inside. So you dump your CSS rules inside that file, and then link that file to your HTML file, using this simple code snippet. Your link rel link, the link tag. Remember that when we're talking about self-closing tags, we mentioned the link tag as one of those tags, right? Self-closing elements. So that's why you've not seen the closing tag for the link tag. Now you have the link. Now rel means relationship. It is the attribute that is used to specify the relationship of the resource that you're trying to link with that HTML file or with that web page, right? In this case, the relationship between the resource that we are specifying in the href, right? That's the hypertext reference. The resource that we are trying to specify there, the relationship between that resource, right, or that file, so to speak, and your current page, the current HTML file that you're working on, that you're trying to link this into, that relationship is style sheet. So this is simply saying link style.css to this HTML file as a style sheet, right? So that is just basically the code snippet there. So you might be asking, this particular one looks very stressful, like, I mean, it looks like a lot of stress. Like, why do I have to now create another file, in order to just write my CSS when I can just write it inline directly on the elements? I know what that feels like, and I understand you. However, this is a best practice, and you would only mostly see why this is important when your project starts getting larger. This is a better way to organize your code so that you separate all your styles from your HTML. right? So that anytime you want to edit anything CSS related, you can go to your CSS file. Anytime you want to edit anything HTML related, you can go to your HTML file, right? However, this particular method can prove challenging for first timers, for beginners. So for our case, I would allow you to use either of inline CSS or internal CSS for your work, right? And then as time goes on, we'll incorporate external CSS. Now, a list of things to learn. You can bookmark this, and this actually would show you a mental picture of the things that you're supposed to learn if you need to, get good at CSS. First thing is you need to know the different ways you can select an HTML element, right? That is the different types of selectors that we have. Remember, when we talked about CSS rule, we mentioned selector, and we'll be mentioning selectors all along. So you need to know the different ways you can select an HTML element. You also need to know the different properties you can use to modify these HTML elements. We've already mentioned some of the properties, like in the previous slides. We mentioned color, we mentioned font weight, we mentioned background color. There's a lot of them. There is margin, there is padding, there is transform, there is animation, there's a lot of things, a lot of properties you can use to modify, right? Or make HTML elements more exciting or more beautiful, right? And then last thing you need to know, or probably not the least, is the different values that those properties can carry and what the structure looks like, because you cannot say you are trying to specify the background color of an element, right? You now say you are now assigning 10 pixels to background color. Those are incompatible property value pairs. So background color property can only take values that are colors, right? So blue, red, green, and the rest. So you also have to understand the compatibility between values and what properties. So basically, that's like the overview of CSS. It's not something that is really hard, trust me. It's something that you would learn as time goes on, right? And I mean it, actually, it's definitely not difficult at all. Like the slide might look difficult, but when we get into it, you realize that it's actually just a piece of cake. So for your own consumption, I have attached here an interactive cheat sheet, so you can play around, get to know different properties, get to know different values, get to know different types of selectors, and things like that. And then yeah, like I said, if you have any questions whatsoever, just type it in the chat and I will just read it out and respond to it as we go along, right? So one quick thing I want to address before we get into coding, which is going to help you. If you've not learned anything, if you've not gotten anything from everything I've said so far, please get this one. There are elements that are classified as block elements. There are elements that are classified as inline elements, right? A block element stands alone on a particular line on your browser, right? Which means if you add two block elements in your HTML, they will never stand side by side. One will stand on top and one will stand below. You'll get to see there are some elements that are blocked by default. Elements like your paragraph tag, your div tag, and the rest. Now, block elements, another thing you should also note, very important. In fact, I would even advise you bookmark when you get this material, bookmark this particular slide, because I promise you that 80% of the issues, the challenges that you're going to face in CSS is going to hinge on your understanding of block or inline elements. You'll be wondering, I've been trying to put these two things together. Why are they not staying together? It's because that element is block. Just change it to an inline element and then you have it. And then you change it to an inline element and you're wondering, I cannot adjust the height, I cannot adjust the width. I'm trying to put space between two of them, but it's not working. That's because the element is inline and you cannot adjust it. However, there's a compromise, but we're not going to talk about it now until we get more understanding of block and inline elements. So it's very simple. Block elements cannot allow other elements to stand side by side with it, right? So they just span the full width of the browser or their parent elements. And they can also have their height, width, and margins manipulated using CSS. Inline elements, however, allow elements to, other elements to stay beside it, but cannot have their height, width, and margin manipulated using CSS, right? So example of a block element is a div. And I'm talking about div now because we're going to use it a lot. Now, the div probably has my own personal award for the most widely used element on the web. Any web page you open, any source code you open, you must see div, being used there. This is because div is a multi-purpose element, right? It's a blank element. It literally was not meant for anything. It does not have a specific use case, but people use it to either group elements, as containers for different things. You can even use div to just make a circle on your web page. But by default, it's a block element, right? Another element that we'll talk about is span. Span and div usually go together because of they are always the perfect definition for block versus inline element. So div is a block element, span is an inline element, as well as input and image and other elements are inline too. So it's also a blank element, doesn't have a specific use case. Very important, these elements do not exist until a content is specified in it. So don't add a div element and then style it and then realize that nothing is still showing on your page and you want to rip your head out. It would simply mean that you've not added a content to that particular div or span. So take note of that too. So span is an inline element by default. And that was a lot of talk. Let's start coding, please. We are just going to code a simple landing page for our portfolio. So I'm just going to open my project folder right now in VS Code. I'm going to open my portfolio folder here. And as you can see, my folder is already set up. I'm going to create my index.html file. First thing to include there in your index.html file is your HTML template. And I'm going to set the title to my portfolio because we're going to start, building our portfolios as well as learning a couple of things. So the first thing I'll just do is show you what an inline CSS looks like. And I'm just going to write welcome to EduStart web design class, right? So if we launch this on our server, on our browser, what we can see the text that we just put up, the h1 tag that we just put up, show up here. So I'm now going to add a style to it. I want to change the color. So I use the style attributes. Remember, I'm doing inline and I'm specifying it on this h1 element. And I specify the color and I say blue, right? When I save this and I go back to my browser, okay, so and I go back to my browser, you can see that the color here has changed. There is a lot of things you can do. I can add, remember I talked about font width, I make that bold, and then there you have it. Now notice that I am adding more styles. I can add more styles because of this delimiter. Because of this delimiter, I can add more styles. Each of these are styles on their own. So this is what we meant by CSS being cascading, right? Remember we talked about that you could follow in succession, either horizontally or vertically. But basically what it means is I can add styles one after the other like this. I could even change, if I want to change the font type, I could change the font family and then maybe use something like Verdana, right? So you just write the font name there and you can see the font has changed. So in the little time that we have, let's look at if we're going to write this same, this same set of styles using the inline CSS method, or sorry, the internal CSS method. What do? We go to our head tag. I would advise that your internal CSS be written inside your head tag. And then I create my style elements. And remember we said that as the content of our style element, we would have CSS rules, right? So I can now specify this particular selector I'm using is called an element selector or a tag selector, where I just specify the name of the tag the tag name of the element I want to select, right? And then put in the style. So I'll just copy, I'll cut this out and put them here. So you see that we have a selector here, our curly braces, and then we have our style declarations, right? So beware also of indentation. That will also help you, to be able to track hierarchy, especially when you're writing HTML and CSS, and most likely all your other codes. So let's save this and see what happens on our browser. We can see that nothing has changed. Why? Because what I'm saying is, I'm attacking selecting all H1 elements and then attaching all this to it. So if I change this to red, we can see that this has changed to red here. Okay, so I could add a couple of things now. So preferably what I'll add is I'm going to use my div tag. Okay, I'm going to use my div tag, bring this in and add, no, let me take this out. I'll just use my div tag, or you know what? I'll use my div tag and add image to it. And what image am I trying to specify here? I specify my image, and then let's see what our site looks like. Okay, so this is quite terrible for now, but it looks nice. It's not too bad. Welcome to our EduStart web design class. I want this to be a bit shorter, so it looks quite nice. So what I'm going to do now is I'll come to my style and select my image tag, right? I select my image tag and then I set the height to be 200 pixels, for instance, right? Let's see what that looks like. So we can see it's a bit smaller there. So there is a lot of things you can do for now. Okay, quickly, let me show you difference between a block element and an inline element, right? So an image element, I said, is a block element. I'm going to create a div element and add a random text to it. One thing I want you to notice also is look at the way the rules are arranged. You have a single rule and then you have another one, below it and everything. That is just still enforcing the cascading nature of CSS. Things are arranged in a cascading manner, right? Just as we described. Now, back to what I was saying concerning, inline and block elements. If I put this random text here and I put a span element here and I say, or let me call this hello and call this world. Now, because the div is a block element, right? World will not be beside this hello. So this is what you're going to have. You're going to have hello on one line and world on another line, right? If you want to visually see what the div looks like, the block element looks like, right click on it and click on inspect, right? When you click on inspect and you hover on it, you see this blue line that runs across. That blue line on your browser right now identifies the element you're looking at. So we can see that the element has already spanned the full width of that particular page. So it is impossible for world to stay beside it. That is a block element. Now, I hover now on the span element and you can see that the blue highlight you notice only, covers the world by itself to show you that it's an inline element. And also that if I add another span element and call this love, for instance, you would notice that world and love will stay together because both of them are what? Inline elements, and inline elements allow other elements like sibling elements to stay, beside them. We are out of time, and so if you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to head over to the EduStart platform, and yeah, we would feel free to head over to the EduStart platform. Oh, feel free to head over to the EduStart platform, ask your questions there, and I would respond to all of them there. Right? So whatever questions you have, please, let's take it over there as we are out of time. Thank you very much for being a part of this class. I appreciate everyone that made it to the class. And yeah,